Um, really happy to welcome one of our own community members, Mansa Shroff, who's a BT1 member and a global fellow there, and just excited to have her. She's going to be interviewing Ashveena now and talking about health equity as we stay on this diversity and equity and inclusion hour in this track for urban and rural populations. Mansa, first of all, thank you for your time today and for leading this, and great to see you, and turning the virtual podium over to you.
Great to see you too, Stan. Lovely to meet everyone in HITLAB. Ashveena, hi, can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear you, and happy to be here.
Great. So, just a quick roundup. So it looks like day 1 and day 2 conversations were focused on how to use technology and the areas that it impacts. And today, you and I will be talking about health equity. And although that has been a center for clinical trials, we still have a long way to go. So I know that we both just worked on an excellent article that has come out in Harvard's Health Policy Review, and we focused on a lot of disparities across continents and across populations, both rural and urban. And, it'll be great to kind of deep dive into that and share more about the highlights of the different case studies that we looked at, the startups that we worked with, what they've done right, the other organizations, what they could learn from, and also share a bit more from our experiences. So what do you think about that?
Absolutely.
Great. So, talking about health equity, it's such a broad topic. It talks about how do you ensure that populations across the globe, both rural and urban, have equal access to healthcare and sick care. And when we talk about that, right now our frameworks are based on access of sick care. Our technologies are not, online with how healthcare can be accessed or how you can efficiently develop models around the use of healthcare. What do you think is a perfect business model so that, governments and agencies can come together and improve health equity across populations?
Yeah, I think that's the question. That's the $1 million question or $1 billion question, right? And I think that's the problem that both you and I have been working on. As I was listening to Anne before, I couldn't help reflecting how overlap like the different problems in different sectors or even different areas of the world are, right? And unfortunately, up to now, and the reason why we actually started this research is because we could compare what was going on in the US and what was going on outside, and this really huge gap in the business models or in how efficient startups were able to make progress in different areas and regions of the world. So what we've seen is really, unfortunately, Mansa, very traditional business models, which is either on one end, one model that is heavily subsidized by governments or by funders and grants and, the traditional ones. Or we've seen one where it's fully for profit, and there's a huge struggle. And we've seen that as well. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about the different companies that we looked at. And all companies, all startups that we've interviewed across, and we had conversations with quite a few of them, even though we only highlighted about 4 or 5 in our papers. I think we must have interviewed at least 20 or 25 in low and middle income economies. They all mentioned one thing, is how hard it was to actually get funding, how hard it was to actually find a business model that was sustainable, right? So yeah, I mean, the traditional, my head would go into how do we rally and optimize the nexus of government, private sector, and the nonprofits and community. But this is definitely the $1 million question that I'm hoping that the 95 participants online today can help us figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we think about health equity, I think there's a cookie cutter framework that has been in place, which may not actually be applicable to different parts of the world, right? I think what we deeply learned from having conversations with these startups that we worked with and interviewed is that the model that works in parts of Maharashtra in India will absolutely not work in sub-Saharan Africa because the culture is different, access to healthcare is different, ability to translate and understand digital health is different. And I think all of those factors impact health equity, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the the way to think about it is, how do we reinvent the way we gather data as well? Because I think with our way of doing things, we are very traditional and linear and kind of thinking, let's do business the same way, which is, let's make sure we have quality data, we have interoperability between the different institutions, we have a standardization, we have XYZ, right? I think it's time for us to find ways to leapfrog from what is the kind of data that's already available in Maharashtra or in other parts of the world?
Yep.
How do we use the different machine learning algorithm to actually curate this data and get something out of it? Because the data exists, it's just in different format. It's just, it may still be in paper, or it may simply be in different siloed kind of institutions, but the data exists. It just doesn't exist the way we understand it from the US perspective. And that is the one thing that is blocking a lot of our thinking, is we just don't know how to optimize on what's out there. How do we reinvent this? Everybody has a smartphone now, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do we track? What are the measures that we can track that will reflect on what is actually happening on the ground? And this can be something as simple as, let's find out what is the purchase of X equipment, how many people are buying painkillers, and then kind of correlating it. And it may not be super accurate at the beginning, but it will give us more clarity on where we're going.
Correct. Yeah. And, you mentioned a really good point about smartphones, right? And when we think of health equity, we think of, smartphones, because that's the access point each one of us has. But what about parts of the world where smartphones are still not as popular? Through our case studies, we came across a great startup called mPedigree that works in South Africa. And they've been harnessing mHealth, using mobile devices to talk about drugs and, how to make sure that, the ones that are available in the market are the real ones, because, there has been discrepancy in how these drugs have been made available in parts of South Africa. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think mPedigree case is a very interesting one, because we tend to go to the other end, which is AI and machine learning, but then there are so many steps in between. And sometimes just a text or WhatsApp group, for instance, works extremely well in gathering data and communicating and educating people, or simply in providing some sort of health assistance, that can save a life in the end. So mPedigree is an interesting model. But I still think that there's a lot of thought to be given to how do we harness the data that's there, and that may not necessarily go through a smartphone, right?
Yeah.
There's so many point of contacts that can exist in society in the different countries. There's a program being tested right now where medication is being delivered in villages very far by drones, right?
Yeah.
These drones have an inbuilt data collection mechanism. So how do we then connect that to a centralized system and understand what's going on the ground? The case of Nirama is also an interesting one.
Yes, absolutely.
That's decentralized, low cost, going to the rural areas, very accessible, because we're talking about breast cancer. So there's an issue of, taboo and sensitivity, as well as how do we reach out women, and how do we get them to understand that they need to do their regular checks. But it's a case where the data is not really in the hands of the patient. It's being collected by a midpoint, sent to a centralized system, which is then being accessed by healthcare specialists and professionals and radiologists, and then kind of having some kind of feedback loop. And I think this is the kind of model that can help countries or societies where they don't necessarily have a smartphone in their hands.
Right. And you raise a really good point about diagnosis and clinical trials, right? I think in light of the topic of the conversation, health equity, we've come to learn as an industry that the drugs that we have today may not be as representative as we thought it would be for everyone. We need diverse population and diverse sample sizes to come and become a part of these clinical trials, because and that can only happen if there's equal access of healthcare between urban and rural populations. So, for example, if I live in downtown Cambridge, it's easier for me to come to a clinical trial in Kendall Square. But if I were to live in Salem, I have to take a purple line, take it all the way down and reach Kendall Square, which is much harder. In that sense, what are your thoughts on frameworks, the areas that government can support, the areas that private funders can support, to improve health quality, health equity, and health access?
Yeah, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 things that governments can do. One is to support the development of just labs that are running clinical trials in different countries.
Yeah.
I think right now it's super centralized. It's between Europe and the US. Drug development is heavily on this side of the world, which means that in phase 1 and 2, we don't have access to a large population size. And then by the time it gets to African countries or in Asia, it's already kind of too late and we're not included in the pool. But investing in labs that want to run clinical trial from day one in different countries and different parts of the world is very important. Access also goes through access to basic things, whether it's active ingredients, whether it's lab equipment. And then we also have a pipeline of what does it look like? Who is going to work in those labs, right?
Yeah.
We still have like a severe lack of people, of skill sets. So how do governments rethink their education system to promote sciences in schools, for instance, so that we provide a pipeline of scientists in all the labs? I want to talk, maybe end on the regulatory issues, which is super important. I think one of the great hurdles for startups wanting to use digital health to promote access to health care in all over the world, but most specifically in low and middle income economies, is the regulatory system. Yeah. Every time they have to do something, either it's siloed or they have to start it again if they want to go in another state, in another country. Yeah. And in today's world where we have no borders through our apps, everybody who has an app, whether you're in Cambridge or in Mumbai or in South Africa, it doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
But for those startups, they have to start this process all over again. And that can take 1 or 2 years, by which time, you've missed your business development boat. Yeah. And that's.
Yeah, it's so important for these startups to have a first mover advantage, have the ability to scale, because you can have the best technology out there. You can have the best vision to, reach parts of Asia that haven't been reached before, but to have the right framework and the support, not only from different stakeholders like the government, but also consumers, and also, maybe through public-private partnerships, right? Having that ability to scale up, I think, is so important. And hopefully we can create frameworks that allow startups to do so.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Mansa and Ashveena, thank you so much for such a tremendous conversation and interview today. Thank you both.
Thank you, Stan, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And there you have it, HITLAB community, just a wonderful session, a wonderful track of the last 60 minutes around diversity, equity, inclusion, and more importantly, as the last discussion that Mansa led, really understanding some of the nuances of working within a developing ecosystem and healthcare ecosystem that is developing, where not everyone's going to have a smartphone. As a matter of fact, smartphone adoption rates are in the low double digits. And we're talking about, voice messaging platforms, as the study I led in Ghana in 2015 with the Gates Foundation, the Grameen Foundation, and the University of Ghana School of Public Health showed that it was a voice messaging system that had some impact with improving child mortality rates. But really, it was this idea of being able to provide new moms with either vaccine updates or clean water tools, like a water purification tool, or mosquito netting, or again, breastfeeding instructions and things like that over voice messages that their public health nurse that was working with their local village would provide. Again, going into that study, we thought that was going to be a massive win. And we saw that it had marginal incremental improvements in the overall usage of those 4 different interventions to reduce childhood mortality. And ultimately, it was the simple instructions on breastfeeding that seemed to be the most adopted, because even like anyone else who's going and trying to get a script filled or something, when it starts getting in the way of a normal daily routine, it's a much more difficult thing to do. So there's complex issues and complex tasks. The most important thing for the audience on today that we would really recommend from the HITLAB perspective is to travel to a developing healthcare ecosystem in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, spend a week or 2 weeks or a month there on the ground and see what folks are doing, see how folks are interacting with digital technologies, and just reset your assumptions on digital technology adoption in those developing ecosystems. They're vastly different than what we see here in the United States or in Canada or in Europe. And that's the best way to actually understand it, is to be there in first person, spending time and looking at how people are using digital technologies or not using digital technologies as it might stand. So that wraps up our diversity, equity, and inclusion hour for this year's, or this today's HITLAB Summit. And again, we had one yesterday as well. If you did not see that, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. When these videos are dropping from the HITLAB media team, you will see them. If you're subscribed, you'll get notifications, and you can tune in to the latest tools, techniques, and technologies that are improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in digital health.